Tea. Me. Good to go. Welcome to Dead Good Book Reviews. I'm Judith, and today I'm bringing you some of the weirdest books on my shelf. Now, before you start commenting, we're going to define weird. Now, I'm aware that weird is a pretty subjective thing. I'm not going to sit here and suggest that every book that does not depict a 20-something white lady's activities is weird just because it's different from my cultural norm. I'm defining weird here as the kind of book where, when you start to explain it, you at some point have to say, now bear with me here. Do you know the kind of book that I mean? If not, stick around, listen to the list. You'll probably figure it out by the time we get to the end. So I've picked out 8 books, some of which are books that were sent to me for review, some of which are books I bought myself, a lot of which are books that I have on the recommendation of other booktubers. Kicking off with a book that I don't think will surprise anyone who's been around on this channel for a while. This is The Gutter Prayer by Gareth Hanrahan. This is so good. This is the first book in the Black Iron Legacy, which is a series that is currently 2 books long, and I absolutely adore this, but it is weird. This is an epic fantasy book where in the first book, an orphan, a ghoul, and a cursed man have to expose a conspiracy that could bring their city, which is kind of an eternal city, toppling down. Not too weird, I know, but bear with me. This book has some of the weirdest, not even world building, because the world isn't that weird, but the weirdest kind of setting building, I guess, that I've ever encountered. And within that, it has some of the coolest villain building I've ever encountered. So imagine you commit a crime and then you're taken off to a place where you're turned basically into a wax tallow man, which is like a wax creature that then is the law enforcement for the city. And in this book, one of them is chasing around. It's absolutely horrifying, but we also get the point of view of that character, which is extra creepy. A creature that is made out of a mass of worms that's just trying to be in a humanoid shape. And that absolutely terrifies me because I'm afraid of any like large swarms of insects. But it's so cool. Horrifying, yes. Worth reading, absolutely. If you're feeling like your epic fantasy reading is getting kind of stuck in a rut, then I highly recommend The Gutter Prayer, and I think you will probably also enjoy the sequel, The Shadow Saint, which is also very good and follows a different character from the first book. So if you weren't 100% sold on book 1, book 2 is good. It's less weird, I think, or maybe it just had less of an impact because of book 1, but they are both great. Personally, I love this book and this series because it just sparks something in my imagination. The more I read and the more I talk about books, especially on this channel, which gives me the opportunity to kind of live talk about what I'm doing, the more I realise how important atmosphere is to me in a book. I can forgive a lot of sins in world building and plot holes and all of the above if the atmosphere is right, and this absolutely has it in spades. Right, you knew there was going to be some Frances Hardinge on this list. Frances Hardinge is phenomenal. Only Frances Hardinge could create a book where the creation of cheese is somehow magical and a huge part of the plot. Only Frances Hardinge could create a girl who is possessed by the spirit of a bear, and her world building is always phenomenal and interesting and intricate and simultaneously very simple on the surface, and it works really well. I've decided to highlight her most recent book, Deep Light, because it's one of my favourites. Is anyone surprised that I love the one that is set by the sea? No. This book is set in a world where there used to be these huge kind of ocean gods, and they no longer exist anymore, but the kind of economy / black market of this world is they're dredging the pieces of the gods up and using them for various nefarious purposes. It's delightfully strange, and there's also something, the comparison I always draw is Pacific Rim, and I think that's just the mental image it gets for me. It's nothing like Pacific Rim in pretty much every other way, but it's just epic in that proportion, and it's a very simultaneously very small and huge story, which I really enjoyed. I was absolutely captivated by this the first time I read it, and it's interesting because I don't normally go for books with a young male protagonist. Often I find they're just awful. Life is ruined by the likes of Robert Muchmore and such. But in this case, the main character, Hark, is just really lovely and well written and not too obnoxious. He does some stupid stuff, but he's not obnoxious, which is what I often hate in a young male protagonist. And I think even if he had been awful, I probably would have still loved this book because, again, atmosphere. Just a quick tea break. If you were looking for a place to start with Frances Hardinge, my first book of hers that I read was The Lie Tree, which won a lot of awards, and quite rightly so. But if you want to get a taste for her kind of weird world building, I would say maybe go for Cuckoo Song is a really interesting one. Or maybe even Skinful of Shadows. I think Skinful of Shadows is one of the stronger. But to be honest, pick up any of them and you will have a good time. A Face Like Glass is good too. Oh, they're all good. You can tell I'm pulling out the older books on my shelves because they're dusty and I'm getting sneezy. Moving on to a book that I used to talk about all the time when I first started blogging because it was one of the books that I read right at the start of that kind of journey. And I don't talk about it anymore, and I haven't talked about it much, if at all, on this channel. So that's weird. It kind of came back into my life while I was making my notes for this video. This is Serafina by Rachel Hartman, who also wrote Shadow Scale, which is the sequel, and Tess of the Road, which is like a companion novel set in the same world with similar characters. Do you like dragons? I'm assuming that because you're watching this channel you do. Do you kind of wish those dragons were more obsessed with logic and mathematics? I mean, yeah, of course you do. Do you fancy a book that tackles exploring religious prejudices and is actually two very different books, cut in half, and is just weird and wonderful and looks at dragons in a whole new way? And yes, I think you do. I think I'm just going to tell you that you do. In all seriousness, these books aren't for those who just want kind of a fun dragon book. They aren't that. They're much more about identity and belonging and believing in yourself and all that kind of like somewhat saccharine stuff, but it just works in this narrative. I genuinely think these are among some of my favourite dragon books, which is another series I should make, but I think I would have to talk about Christopher Paolini in that video, and not that tempted to get into that. But these are some of my favourites. What I love most about these books is partly how different the first and second book in the duology is. They're very, very different narratives and plot points with very different villains, and it's cool. It's kind of like you're getting two completely different books, which I actually really enjoy. These books also include a lot of LGBT plus representation that is done in a way that's very subtle. It's not in a sense of like brush the gays under the carpet. They're here so that you won't moan about the fact that they're not here. But we're not going to talk about them much. They are very much there, and it's very much built into the setting. And I don't think they could have avoided that with the way that the book goes into religious prejudice. I think that's really interesting. But they are there, and it's really lovely, and it talks a lot about cultural differences, and I think from my reading of it pulls a lot from the fact that Christianity, and it's not about Christianity but the kind of parallels there, tackles it really badly, and other cultures had a much better handle on it before colonisation. And there's a lot there, and maybe someone else would read it completely differently, but I really like this duology. The next book is one that I hummed and hard about adding to this list. Hummed and hard? Not sure. This is The Quantum Magician by Derek Kunsken. This came out a couple of years ago, I think. On the one hand, this book is not going to appeal to everyone, and is this a recommendations list? I'm not sure. It's quite dense, there's a lot to take in, but on the other hand it's a really good conversation starter, and I actually really enjoyed reading it when I read it. I've just had no desire to go back and read it again. Because what if this book is perfect for you and you really want to read quantum physics heist books? I mean, when I first read this I described it as kind of a physics textbook wearing a heist book jumper, and it's so true. It is a lot of physics. I cannot fact check it whatsoever. That is not my skill point. We're all going to have to persuade Angela to read this and then find out what her thoughts are. Imagine that it's the future and there's now a kind of human, like an evolutionary branch of humanity, who can do things with their brain that allow them to basically do expansive quantum mechanics-y stuff in a kind of fugue state. But imagine that, but it's also a heist book, so we have the whole getting the crew together bit and performing the heist, and something goes terribly wrong, and all that formula there, but with all this extra physics added in. There's also kind of like the SEAL character who can't stop swearing. There's an explosives expert who's like sassy and fun. It's probably my favourite element of the book. There's an AI that was built by a bank, but the AI got too intelligent and decided it was the reincarnation of St. Matthew, the apostle, and now exists not to be a banking AI because they couldn't get it to do that anymore, but it's like, let me convert you to my Christianity because I'm St. Matthew. And I just find that really entertaining. It's really funny within the book. There's a lot of humour there. I read this assuming it would be a really difficult read, and in some ways it was. I think if you're not science-brained, you probably just have to do what I did and kind of switch off your brain for those bits and just skim over them and stick to the character bits. Again, if you really, really read science fiction for the science, it might be a completely different reading experience for you. I thought it was going to be one of those situations of you request it, then it gets approved and you kind of think, oh no, why did I request this? It's going to be a terrible time. But actually I really enjoyed it and ended up requesting the sequel, and I enjoyed that as well. That's The Quantum Garden. So yeah, I would say if this sounds interesting, go for it, but this isn't a wholehearted recommendation for everyone. Continuing in a similar vein of it's very sciencey and also I wouldn't recommend it for everyone necessarily. Did anyone else read Stronger, Faster and More Beautiful? This book is a kind of collection of short stories that follow on from each other, so it's very different elements. You're kind of seeing tableaus across time in this world where it kind of starts with genetic engineering of humanity and goes off from there, and basically is kind of an exploration of, well, what would happen and how could this go wrong or go right, and that was really interesting. It's a thought-provoking book for sure. It lost me a little. If I'm remembering correctly, we got to the story of this like dolphin boy, and it all got a little bit much for me. I was trying to remember when I read this, and it was either kind of in the middle of the day very quickly or in the middle of the night similarly quickly, so I'm not recommending it wholeheartedly. It's not something I would go back and reread, but I thought it would be a good one to include on this list because I don't think I've read anything that tackles it in quite the same way. I remember it sparking a lot of thoughts in my head about the ethics and the science of it all. I won't pretend they were particularly profound thoughts, but they were there. Next I have Other Words for Smoke by Sarah Mary Griffin. On the one hand, this is kind of a sapphic coming of age story, which is great and lovely, and it has these nice pink sprayed edges, and you think, oh, this is pretty and cute. On the other hand, there's this creepy owl that lives in the wallpaper that eats bones. It's kind of a haunted house story as well, and the more I talk about it in this video, the more I realise I need to go back and reread this because all that has stuck with me is the owl that eats bones. I can't remember anything else. A cat that's more than a cat, a dark power, neon magic and escape. Yeah, I have a vague recollection of a lot of stuff about this and I definitely need to reread it. And I don't know how much of the weirdness of it comes from the kind of dissonance of this like pretty pink, very kind of YA branded cover and package, contrasting with this very dark story. I don't know, interesting. I'll definitely be rereading this at some point. I might push it into my August TBR, so stay tuned. I think you probably saw this coming, but Children of Time by Adrian Tchaikovsky. I don't actually own Children of Time, I only own Children of Ruin. I have Children of Time as an audiobook, so I will put the cover up, but this is the sequel. So we're way in the future and humanity has had to leave Earth, but side project, they've terraformed this planet and their plan is to drop down some monkeys and a virus that will accelerate their evolution to the point where eventually they'll be evolved enough and they'll see humans as their gods. You know, normal stuff. But the evolution ends up not happening to the monkeys, but happens to the spiders and some of the other insects on this planet, and basically we get this sprawling story in two halves. So we have humanity desperately trying to find a place to settle, and there's a lot of time jumps of humanity are in cryostasis for most of the book. So the same characters coming out again and again and seeing the world anew, and then you have this story of the evolution of spiders into kind of sentient beings. So yeah, giant sentient space spiders, and what would the world be like if it were built by spiders and not by humans, and how they see the world and how that would influence how their technology worked, and oh, it's so good. But if spiders aren't for you, or you want less spiders and more cephalopods, you can read the sequel. I read this book on Justine's recommendation, and it's further proof that I should just always read what Justine reads, and this should just be, I should read that because I should read that Reddit. That should be my new channel name. I've since recommended this book to pretty much everyone I know. So far nobody has hated it. I've not recommended it to any serious arachnophobes though, so maybe that's why, but I just think it's beautiful and such an imaginative world. So much of this list has been sci-fi, and I wonder if maybe I just find sci-fi weird because I don't read a lot of it. Next I want to talk about Battle Beyond the Dull Stars. I've forgotten who wrote this, I read it quite some time ago, but the cover will be on screen for you. We're familiar with science fiction where robots are the main characters. We've all encountered this, but in this world we have household appliances are the main characters, like sentient household appliances. So one of the characters is a sentient printer, and there's this big interstellar war happening and the humans are at war with the robots, but the robots are household appliances. It's good stuff. Now this is actually a sequel. I have not read the first one, but this one works on its own and it's the one I've read, so this is the one I'm going to hesitantly recommend. I don't read a lot of humour focused books, which this definitely is, so if you read oodles of them and you've read this and thought it was terrible, then I might just not be au fait with the genre. But this is so much fun and so unique and shook up my reading in a way that I really needed it to. And yeah, it's just good. Like, of course I want a bread maker who is also a motorbike. There's just cool stuff happening and interesting ideas. And again, it's taking this very high concept and turning it into a book, and sometimes that works very well and you can also get a full story out of it, and sometimes you think this was really more of a short story, darling, let's calm down. But in this case I think because it's so light-hearted, it's just a nice time. I think this is a fun book if you want to mix up stuff on your TBR, or if you're feeling very slumpy and you just want to try something new. Battle Beyond the Dull Stars, I think you'd have a good time. Those are my 8 books. There are many more weird books in the world, and also, again, weird is such a subjective thing. You might think that giant sentient space spiders is perfectly normal in books if you read a lot of that stuff. All of the caveats that come with that. Those are my 8 weird books that I have read as yet. I really love a book that does something different and does something new. I think especially when you come from a background of reading a lot of YA, which can get very formulaic, it's nice to shake things up and read something completely different. And also it's fun to talk about because you get to say things like giant sentient space spiders, or owl that lives in the wallpaper and eats bones. Like, it's just fun to do. I dare say there will be more weird books in my future. There will be more wonderful recommendations from other people, but if you want to recommend anything that is a book that you find it very hard to explain to people, but you have to say, just bear with me on this, do drop it in the comments below. I would really, really love to have more to add to this list and maybe do a second part at some point in the future. You can also subscribe, it makes me feel loved and appreciated, and of course I will see you in the next one.